Welcome to 20th Century Music and Arts. On this episode, we're going to continue to look at Pere Ubu and the whole proto-punk music scene of Cleveland.
The point of Pere Ubu and the point of our career was to establish a language and to be able to develop things over a period of time and to see, just very quickly, I don't care if you don't have any time, you ask me these questions, I'm answering them. You look at that, you say, that's a cup, I'll buy that cup, I recognize that cup. But this cup is also this, and it's that, and it's looking at it this way and that way, and all sorts of ways of looking at it. Now, you wouldn't buy that. They wouldn't advertise it like a cup like this in a store and say, buy this, because you'd say, what's that? And you'd say, oh yeah, that's a cup. I don't want to buy that, no. But that's the cup, too. All of this is the cup. So you have to see it from all different angles.
After Rocket from the Tombs had imploded, two bands would actually form. Gene O'Connor would put together a band with Johnny Mendansky and Stiv Bators, and they called it Frankenstein. Now, the band played covers by bands like Kiss, Mott the Hoople, and Alice Cooper, along with the Rocket songs that O'Connor had written, particularly Sonic Reducer. However, they kind of were not appreciated by the crowd that liked the Electric Eels and the Mirrors, and in fact, after playing a gig with Pere Ubu at the Viking, the venue seemed to mysteriously burn down. Well, Frankenstein decided to head to New York and revamp their image. Now, we're going to come back to them later. Now, the band that David Thomas and Peter Laughner had formed was certainly not going to be any kind of conventional rock band. At the suggestion of his teacher father, Thomas chose the name Pere Ubu, after the character from the Alfred Jarry play Ubu Rye. The idea for the band was to be kind of a studio band so that Thomas could actually get something on vinyl to document, his involvement in music before he would go off and get a regular job. When he proposed his ideas to Peter, Peter said he would like to join in as well. Now, Thomas wanted to get Rocket's soundman Tim Wright involved, even though Tim did not play any instruments. Thomas figured that Wright would be just an interesting musician, and he became the bass player while Thomas would handle the vocals and Laughner would be on guitar. Soon they would bring in guitarist Tom Herman, drummer Scott Krause, and Alan Ravenstein on synthesizer. Now, it would be Ravenstein's inclusion that would be a huge game changer for the sound of the band. He could not necessarily play like a conventional piano player, organ player, but rather he would bring in all kinds of soundscapes and noises, kind of giving this musique concrète feel to Pere Ubu's sound. And that was part of Thomas's vision. He wanted to create a sound that fused the sort of absurdist avant-garde world into a rock band. The original idea was just to record two old Rocket from the Tombs songs, 30 Seconds Over Tokyo and Final Solution. However, during their initial rehearsal, this song called Heart of Darkness began to emerge. Now, when they got into the studio, they recorded 30 Seconds Over Tokyo and Heart of Darkness as a single. Both of these songs were post-punk in sound, but it was proto-punks in terms of the music history timeline. 30 Seconds Over Tokyo is a surreal rock song. It's absolutely fantastic, and it's got its title from the novel and later movie of the same name based on the Doolittle raids in 1942 and World War II. The song is a heavy, psychedelic, surreal, experimental, almost goth rock, and it kind of goes all over the place here, and it's got this wah-wah sound atop of kind of rhythmic guitar, and as music critic Simon Reynolds states, it's like some loopy, rhythmically sprained hybrid of Black Sabbath and reggae. And there's a section in the middle where it all kind of just falls apart, sort of, where each member goes into crazy free improvisation and then it comes back together again. The song is absolutely fantastic. Please check it out.
Flew off early in the years of dawn, in a metal dragon lost in time.
Now, Heart of Darkness, of course, inspired by the Joseph Conrad novella, is a driving yet drony masterpiece. Now, again, these two songs are ahead of their time, and they're taking the ideas of krautrock, things like Can and Neu and Faust, and then and other proto-punk stuff, maybe like the Stooges and the Velvets, and they're providing a link to what you would hear later in British post-punk and like American underground music in the early 80s.
Maybe I'm nothing but a shadow on the wall.
Now, the single was released in December 1975, and the band started to get more notice than they expected. People in New York and London started hearing about the single, and they would go back into the studio to record 2 more songs. Of course, the controversial Final Solution, a song that they'd actually don't like to play anymore because of the title, but it was actually an epic sort of incel anthem. And you know, you hear this thing now and it can pass for like 90s indie rock, and it still sounds fresh today. And again, you got the use of keyboard and also guitar noises along with this like thumping bass, like the soundtrack for some sort of post-apocalyptic industrial town. Like kind of like I visualize Eraserhead when I hear the song. John Peel was a huge fan of the song and played it on his radio show.
The girls won't touch me 'cause I got a misdirection.
The B-side was Cloud 140. This is foreshadowed the band's quirkiness, and it had a kind of frantic rockabilly rhythms that The Fall would start playing a couple of years later.
Here she comes, here she comes, she's okay.
These 2 singles show a darker, heavier sound to Pere Ubu they never quite have in the same way, but that was not the only issue with the band. Peter Laughner was becoming, he'd show up to practice drunk, and his overall substance intake was becoming lethal. I mean, there's stories of him injecting cough syrup. When they played a gig in New York, he was out of control, and it just became evident to the band that he couldn't really be in here anymore. Tom Herdman wanted to take over the lead guitar spot from Laughner, so Laughner was fired from the band in 1976. Now, he would continue to make music with his own new band called Friction, maybe named after the television song. But we'll come back to Peter's story later. But there were other internal problems within the band. Tim Wright and Alan Ravenstein who was kind of in and out of the band, would have sort of different visions musically. And Wright would end up leaving, and he'd travel to South America. Now, after spending time there, he would end up in New York, where he would form the no-wave band DNA. And maybe I'll do a video on them and the other no-wave bands at some point. But Pere Ubu started to congeal under Thomas's absurdist vision. Tony Maimone was brought in to replace Tim Wright, and he'd actually been playing with Friction for a short time. And they would release the single Street Waves with / My Dark Ages in December 1976. And another single in 1977, The Modern Dance in Heaven. The band was now signed to Blank Records, not the same label run by Glenn Danzig. The quirky, surreal approach of Thomas had fully taken over, and what was being produced was a kind of Dada-esque rock pop that was, based around Thomas's unique vocal style that yelps, mumbles, passionately yells. Yet everything kind of finds its way back to kind of like a pop chorus. It's very interesting, and the lyrics are surreal and completely obtuse. It's really hard to compare Pere Ubu to another rock band, and they really have to be heard to be understood. Well, maybe understanding them is actually impossible. They would eventually have enough recorded material to release their debut album, The Modern Dance, released in February 1978. Now, the album merges kind of punk rock and prog rock experimental and avant-garde weirdness, and again, it deconstructs rock music and pulls apart like a Chuck Berry riff while these sound stakes are going in the back, and of course you've got David Thomas doing all this weird stuff, but then it comes back to these kind of obtuse pop hooks. The album starts out with the excellent Non-Alignment Pack, a song where Thomas makes a plea for love and wants to get the leaders of the world to know about it, or at least that's what I think it means when I looked over the lyrics. Other highlight tracks include the title track, Street Waves, the experimental Chinese Radiation, Life Stinks, which was another old Rocket from the Tombs number, and the absolutely bizarre Sentimental Journey, with this kind of like music concrete noises.
Down at the boss, Mandra, end of the town, Mandra.
Throughout the album, Ravenstein uses the keyboard to create bizarre soundscapes, and he doesn't really play it like a conventional instrument. Now, while the album did not sell very well, it did expand the following of the band on both sides of the Atlantic. They would follow up with Dub Housing. This album is amazing. This album was put together in a much shorter period of time and really was the realization of David Thomas's absurd post-industrial rock vision. The album would be released in November 1978, and it would be influential, particularly on the British post-punk scene. On the opening track, Navy, Thomas opens by stating that he's got these arms and legs that go flip-flop, flip-flop, and he's got desire. Yeah, trying to figure this out is always a bit of a challenge. And the listeners put through this strange tapestry again of avant-garde noise, quirky rhythms, yelp, and underneath all of it, you can find some pop melody. Highlight tracks include, of course, Navy, the title track, Calgary's Midder, and Codex, but really, it's a solid album from start to finish.
Have you heard about this house? Inside 1,000 voices talk, and that talk echoes around and around.
What do you do with a drunken sailor? Who do you see in Calgary's mirror? I think about you all the time. I did this and I went there.
And again, I think it's a masterpiece. And, the New Music Express out of the UK declared the album to be the 8th best of 1978. And again, the band continued to develop their following. Now, in the meantime, since leaving Pere Ubu, Peter Laughner's situation had not become good. And his life had kind of been this downward spiral. He had a volatile relationship with his wife, who he divorced, and his friction fell apart, and he formed another band called Peter and the Wolves. It was kind of a Mark II because he had a version of that band in the early 70s. But he could not really keep anything going musically because his hedonistic lifestyle would eventually end in his demise. Despite doctors' warnings that he'd use downers like Valium and barbiturates and anything he get his hands on, he'd mix it with alcohol. And unfortunately, eventually this lifestyle caught up with him, and in 1977 he died from acute pancreatitis, and he was only age 24. His friend Lester Bangs wrote a eulogy for him entitled Peter Laughner is Dead. And this is a shame because Peter Laughner was a powerful singer-songwriter who he's kind of a bridge between that Bob Dylan world and what you'd find with the nihilistic punk rock of the 70s. And over the years, he's started to be recognized for his body of work, and there's a great compilation, which includes not only his stuff from Rocket from the Tombs, but also a lot of the acoustic stuff he had done earlier. And it's called Take the Guitar Player for a Ride. It's released in 1994 on the Tim Kerr label, and really, please check it out. Peter Laughner's just great.
Hey, you reach for the electric, you're gonna get a shock. You reach in my pocket, you got to rock it down. Ain't it fun when you know that you're gonna die young?
Now, let's go back to Frankenstein. They went over to New York and they morphed into something called the Dead Boys, and their sound fully embraced the punk sound coming out of both New York and now the United Kingdom. And they frequently played CBGBs, and their live shows were known for profanity and lewdness. In 1977, they released their debut album, Young, Loud, and Snotty. It is an amazing punk rock classic. And of course, it's made famous by the opening track, Sonic Reducer.
I don't need anyone, don't need no mom and dad, don't need no food advice.
Really powerful, straight ahead, gutsy punk rock. This is an incredible album. Other great tracks include What Love Is, and of course the controversial Caught with the Meat in Your Mouth.
Want to know? Want to know? I want you to know what love is. All flesh burn my brain. Your tongue lashes out me insane.
And it's just balls to the wall, start to finish. They would release the album We Have Come For Your Children in 1978. Fortunately, drummer Johnny Blitz would actually get stabbed in a street altercation like 5 times, and there was a fundraiser done for him where Jerry Nolan of the New York Dolls filled in on drums, but comedian John Belushi, who was becoming a punk rock fan, helped out too. Eventually, though, members started leaving the band, and Stiv Bators was the only remaining member. And Bators, he kind of changed. He tried to become this punk rock pop singer, but that never really worked out, so he formed Lords of the New Church with Brian James of The Dam. But unfortunately, he would end up dying as a result of the aftermath of a motorcycle accident, and because of the head injury sustained. His girlfriend actually ended up spreading his ashes over Jim Morrison's grave, because this happened in Paris, and he was a huge Morrison fan. Now, I'm just going to go over other stuff that was happening in Ohio at the time, especially in neighboring Akron, which is kind of south of Cleveland. There's a band called Tim Huey, who've been around since 1972. They played a kind of quirky art rock that was inspired by the Stooges and Frank Zappa. They're not quite as avant-garde as Pere Ubu, but they have a really unique new wave and kind of quirky prog rock sound, and they released a great album called Contents Dislodged During Shipment in 1979, and they actually had a minor hit with the cover of Daydream Believer, the Monkees song written by Neil Diamond. They were followed with the EP English Kids in 1980, but success really eluded them, and they broke up in 1982. Now, Tin Huey was, again, they're from Akron, and there's actually a thing called the Akron Sound, which included bands like Chai Pig, the Bizarros, the Rubber City Rebels, but of course the most famous of these bands was Devo. Now, I'm not really going to go into great detail about Devo because they really deserve their own episode, but Devo play this sort of satirical form of rock based on the concept of devolution, or de-evolution, a kind of criticism of herd consumer society. And Devo was like deadpan surrealism, and the band weighed these strange matching uniforms, they're kind of astronauts, or sort of. It's really great stuff, and their first singles are absolutely incredible. Stuff like Mongoloid with Jocko Homo.
Are we not meant? We are Devo. Are we not meant? Devo.
Unfortunately, in my opinion, they would embrace more of a commercial sound in the 80s, which, stuff like Whip It, and that's what they're more known for. But, again, I think they really need their own episode. But, let's go back to Pere Ubu. And Pere Ubu will go further and further kind of into the avant-garde in their sound, and really kind of start to leave the rock element behind. New Picnic Time was released in 1979.
Horns, you gotta have heart, hope, you gotta have.
Then the band briefly broke up, and Mayo Thompson from Red Crayola fame was brought in to replace Tom Herdman. Again, moving away from the rock sound, more on The Art of Walking in 1980.
Here's to the small things. Here's to the small things that give pleasure.
And then Anton Fier, who was later famous in the Golden Palominos, was brought in as the new drummer, replacing Scott Krause on Songs of the Bailing Man in 1982. Now, these three albums are solid, but they don't have that edge of rock that is on the first two albums, especially on the early singles. But it's still good stuff. The band would break up, and Thomas would put back it together in 1987, and it's been going ever since under various lineups. What's interesting is in 2003, Cheetah Chrome and Thomas put Rocket from the Tombs back together with Craig Bell and Richard Lloyd of Television, who'd always wanted to play with them. And they even recorded some new material for the albums Barfly in 2001 and Black Record in 2015. 2011 was Barfly. Now, looking at all of this, Pere Ubu is one of the most unique rock bands in the history of rock music, and though their music is very difficult, I find their vision to be very enriching. And the band came from this lesser-known scene in Cleveland that has been overshadowed by cities like New York, Detroit, and London. The story of Pere Ubu and proto-punk Cleveland should be more widely known. Thank you for watching 20th Century Music and Arts. Please like, share, subscribe, and or comment, and let me know what you think of Pere Ubu or any of the other bands in this episode. Thank you.